Okay, I am recording.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm going to give it just a few minutes here to see if anyone joins us at the last minute. Hi guys, thanks for joining us. My name is Misty and I'm with the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. We also have Jenny on from the Dravet Syndrome Foundation as well, just kind of helping us on the back end here. For those of you that are new and haven't joined us before, I just want to go over a few things. If you could just please mute yourself. That way it doesn't, nothing in the background bothers the presenter. Also, if you can hold all questions until the end, we save a good 15 minutes for Q&A. You can also ask those questions live, or you can just kind of hover over the bottom. You'll see that little chat box. You can put your questions there, and Jenny and I can just read those for you if you want. Either way is fine. And the session is being recorded, and after the session is over later on today, we'll make sure we email the link for you to have. The link is also found on our website as well. And with that, I want to introduce Dr. Julie Milder. She is the Senior Medical Science Liaison for Greenwich Biosciences. All right, Julie, I'm going to give it to you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Misty. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today. I am thrilled to have been invited to participate. As a medical science liaison, I am basically a field-based scientist with Greenwich Biosciences. So my job is to educate our communities. So patients and families, as well as healthcare providers, researchers. I'm kind of the link between all those pieces. So I live in Denver. I'm based in the field. I have been in the epilepsy world, though, for 15 years. I've been with Greenwich for a little over 3 years now. But I did my PhD in an epilepsy research lab. So I was an academic epilepsy researcher before. And then I moved to the nonprofit space where I worked for CURE, Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, based in Chicago for almost 6 years as a research director. And then decided I'd done academia and nonprofit, why not go to industry? So and I took my passion for epilepsy to Greenwich when they were building their first medical affairs team, which is what we're called. There's the commercial side of pharma, and then there's the medical side. So one of the most fun things I've done since joining Greenwich is to teach people about cannabis and the science around it. And specifically, obviously for this community, a lot of that work in the US was centered around Dravet syndrome, which has been really exciting for us. So today, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of both, which is I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the broader cannabis. What do we know about cannabis? Some of the terms you might hear if you are in a state where you can go into dispensaries, or things that you're seeing online. I live in Denver, so obviously we have medical and recreational cannabis is legal. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know, share a website with you that is really a great source of information and education. And then I will talk specifically about CBD oral solution, or EPIDIOLEX, at the end, and kind of show you high level some of the data that we had in our trials, and some of the information that is from the prescribing information. So if you have specific questions about the use of EPIDIOLEX, I'm happy to answer those as well. So first, talking about cannabis and cannabinoids. So these terms, so cannabis sativa is the species of the plant. So all marijuana, hemp, these things are all types of cannabis plants. There are varieties of them. And historically, we had different varieties. So if you were to go into a dispensary, and I hear this a lot here in Colorado, and you were to ask a bud tender, as they are termed here in Colorado, you were to ask the bud tender for something that you wanted to, like, oh, you really wanted to get high, they would say you needed a sativa variety of cannabis. It's this tall branch plant with high THC. Whereas if you said, I really need something for my anxiety, I want to chill out, they would tell you you needed an indica variety, which is this, historically, this short, bushier plant that had more equal amounts of CBD and THC, which are the two cannabinoids we've heard a lot about, components of the plant. The truth is that today, there's no such thing as a pure sativa plant or a pure indica plant. They've turned them into sort of marketing terms, for what you will, of products. And now the plants have been so highly interbred that any plant that is being grown, you cannot tell by looking at it if it is high THC or high CBD. It has to be analyzed chemically. So everything is a hybrid that's out there now. And so it's important that whatever product it is being analyzed, not just by looking at it and saying, oh, this one looks like a sativa, because sativa and indica, pure varieties don't exist anymore. They're historical. You'll still see it on labels and products from dispensaries though. And so in the cannabis plant, we have what we call the cannabinoids. And so cannabinoid is just a chemical term. It's just that they look similar in structure chemically. The same way we talk about there are lots of different kinds of sugars and lots of different kinds of carbohydrates based on a chemical structure. So cannabinoids are called cannabinoids because of their chemical structure. Most of them that have been identified come from the cannabis plant. So that's why they've been named this. They're cannabinoids because they come from cannabis. There are over 100 of them now in the cannabis plant that have been identified. The ones we hear the most about are CBD and THC. They're the ones that are the most predominant. They're the easiest to get from the plant, but you might start hearing about some of these others. I know here in Colorado, a lot of people are talking about some of these other, what we call minor cannabinoids, because there isn't as much of them present in the plant. But the big ones that we talk about are CBD and THC. And there are some major differences. The big one being that THC is the one that is responsible for getting someone high, which is why like EPIDIOLEX, for example, being highly purified CBD does not produce that euphoria that you would experience from someone, say, smoking marijuana, because it has so little THC in it that it can't get you high. CBD does not have that same effect. So they're very structurally similar, but they have totally different effects on your brain and on your body. And so that's why, and with over 100 of these in the plant, that's why we think it's important to know exactly what's in any product that anyone is using, because any of these, over 100 of these can have different effects. And if you don't know what's in there, it's hard to know what's going to happen when you consume that product. It's also important to understand that where you find these, where do you find the CBD and the THC in a plant? It tends to be in the flowers. So we see these pictures of marijuana and we think of the leaves. There's these big, broad leaves. But the truth is, if you were to measure the levels of CBD and THC in those leaves, you'd find almost nothing. You have to allow the plant to fully flower in order to get the cannabinoids. And so you can find, you have to isolate the flowers. So this is important because I'm going to talk briefly on the next slide about the different categories of products that are out there. And it's important to remember that in order to get cannabinoids, you need the flowers, because what's really popular right now are the hemp products. And hemp is grown for stalk and seed. And you cannot get appreciable amounts of CBD or THC from the stalk or seed of the plant. So looking at cannabis products that you would find out there, going from left to right, it goes from least regulated to most. So the hemp products that are out there now are the least regulated of all of the products. And that is because even in a state where you might have a medical or recreational marijuana system, that is a state system where there is some regulation. So in Colorado, we have both. They have to be licensed to be a dispensary. And there's certain standards they need to meet or be able to demonstrate. There's testing requirements for things like, the most common one in states is testing for potency, which just means the percentage of THC. That's the most important thing people want to know. You know, people joke around that this is not your it's not the same marijuana as it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, the average percent of THC in a marijuana plant was 6 to 8%. We're now in the 20 to 30% range. The plant has a lot more THC in it. It's a lot more potent. So states are really cracking down on being able to know how much THC is in a product. But they will also, depending on the state, ask for testing of things like heavy metals that could be in the ground of where that plant was grown, other things in the soil like fungus. All of that can end up in the final product, and it needs to be tested for. So the testing in some states is going well, in some states it's not, because again, it's not a regulated testing system. Every state is doing it their own way. But at least with the recreational and medical marijuana systems in the states, they have some bar that they have to pass in order to sell those products. The hemp-based products, which are now everywhere, those exist outside of that system. And the result of that is that there are no rules about the hemp products. Some companies are testing them, but it's totally up to them. It's their choice. So buying a hemp-based CBD product they're now showing up everywhere. You buy them online, grocery stores, etc. Those have fewer regulations than any product out there. And so that is what DEA and FDA and they're all trying to figure out how to regulate the hemp system, because every state wants to grow hemp now for CBD. Historically, hemp was grown for the stalk and the seed, used to make rope and paper and other textiles. And the legal definition was just less than 0.3% THC. And so as long as it has less than that, then you were good. The problem was, and now the confusion, honestly, is that about a year and a half ago, the US passed what is the Agricultural Improvement Act, or people talk about just as the Farm Bill. And what they did is they put in a clause in there. Historically, any cannabinoid you got from hemp was considered Schedule 1, which is the most restricted of drugs, right? It's the most illegal, which was why even when we were doing our clinical trials with EPIDIOLEX, CBD was a Schedule 1 substance. So our doctors had to get special licenses in order to run our clinical trials and just receive the drug into their hospitals. It's a really difficult thing to do research on a Schedule 1 drug. It is considered the most illegal of substances. And so what happened with the Agricultural Improvement Act in 2018 was they put something in there that said, if cannabinoids can be extracted from hemp, they are no longer Schedule 1, they are descheduled. So they have no schedule if they come from hemp, which was why you now see people selling these hemp CBD products everywhere, because it's perceived to be legal, even though they have not found a way of regulating it yet, which is what the states are still trying to do. And so the idea is that we don't know what these hemp-based products are, because like I said, in order to get CBD, you really need flowers on the plant. So sometimes they're planting huge fields of hemp and letting it grow, and then they're taking a lot of plant material in order to try and get CBD from it. A lot of these products also are probably CBD extracted from mature cannabis plants with flowers, and then the CBD is put into hemp oil. And so they're calling it hemp CBD. It could be any of these things. We aren't sure because no one's regulating it. In terms of recreational and medical marijuana, there's no accepted scientific definition of medical marijuana, and there's no difference in the products. And this is something that is very confusing. I know a lot of doctors hate the term medical marijuana because the only thing that makes it medical is that the intent of the use is that it is there to treat a symptom. We don't know anything more about in terms of safety or efficacy, if it works and for what and how to dose it. They're the same products. So in Denver, in Colorado, there are dispensaries that have both licenses. So when you walk in, there's a little window and you have to show them your ID. And if you have a medical marijuana card that you get through a registration system with a doctor, you can go in one door that takes you into the medical side of the dispensary. If you don't, you go into the recreational side. But the products on both sides are the same. The only difference is that they are taxed differently. Recreational marijuana here is taxed higher than medical. The limits are different. you can purchase more on the medical side than on the recreational side. And the age limits are different. You have to be 21 to enter the recreational side. You can be 18 if you have a medical card, and then there are exceptions for pediatric use for certain indications if supported by doctors. Otherwise, the products are the same. So this idea that we might have a higher quality product on the medical side has not been shown to be true. And then obviously on the far right, we have the highest regulation, which is pharmaceutical formulations, which can be plant-derived or synthetic. So while EPIDIOLEX was the first plant-derived cannabinoid approved by FDA, there are synthetic THC products that have already been approved. You might have heard of Marinol. It's a synthetic THC product. It's used for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and then also has been shown to be useful in AIDS wasting disease for anorexia. So there are other cannabinoids that have been approved. They're synthetic though, they don't come from the plant. So it's a little different of a process. So pharmaceutical formulations are controlled preparations, obviously. FDA has evaluated those products for purity, consistency, stability, safety, efficacy. You have to show a lot in order to get something approved by FDA. So this has been a really interesting space for a pharmaceutical company to introduce a new drug into, because this is a very noisy world where we have people kind of putting us in with all these different types of products. And so I just think it's been really wonderful for us. And for me as a scientist, this was totally new space to me. I'm a neuroscientist. I joke, I'm a neuroscientist turned weed scientist. I talk more about cannabis than anything. But I think it's really important for people to understand the space in which we're playing. And then also just because it's everywhere, is kind of understanding the sandbox and kind of knowing what the different types of products are that are out there. And what does that mean to go and get one of these products? Because not everybody is able to get the pharmaceutical formulations, and we completely understand that. And so this is a busy slide. The point is, we hear all the time that the marijuana plant is going to be the cure-all for everything, right? We hear it from everybody. And there's a reason that is out there, and that's because these cannabinoids, they interact with so many systems in our body. And so it depends on, again, over 100 cannabinoids, basically like saying, let's mix 100 different drugs together. Obviously, you're going to have a lot of effects on your brain and on your body. And so we believe that there's a lot of medical potential for this plant. It's just, there are so many potential interactions with how it might affect you that it's become important to study it in a systematic way, which is where Greenwich and our parent company, GW Pharmaceuticals, which has been around for 20 years doing this, they started because they said, this plant has a lot of potential, but we need to break it down into its component parts and really figure out which parts are good for what. And that is how we ended up here with EPIDIOLEX being highly purified CBD, specifically now indicated for seizures, right? You try some of these other cannabinoids, you're not going to find that. THC sometimes has been shown to be proconvulsant. It could induce seizures. So it's important to understand which cannabinoids are in your products so that you know what they might be doing in your body. And so what do we know now? So we know this is an example of preclinical evidence, so things that have been studied in the lab, in cells and in animal models, that various cannabinoids can improve cell survival, decrease neuronal excitability, right? So that's like related to the epilepsy story, modulate your inflammatory response, maybe help with neuronal plasticity, which is how your brain changes in response to events, and maybe in terms of protecting it, neuroprotection, keeping your cells from dying. So we think there's a lot of potential for cannabinoids. Again, depends on which ones you study and what you're studying them for. And clinically, this is where we sit today. I think it's very exciting to think about how this is going to look in 5 or 10 years, now that we are, I think, hopefully in a place where it's becoming easier to study cannabinoids. In the US, we obviously have this anticonvulsant property that's now been identified and approved with EPIDIOLEX. Antispasticity, there's a product that is available ex-US, it's not available here, for spasticity and multiple sclerosis. And that's a combination of cannabinoids. It's not just CBD, it has THC in the product. And then these three on the bottom, analgesic, appetite stimulant, antiemetic. So antiemetic is the anti-nausea effect of the THC products like Marinol in chemotherapy, induce nausea, appetite stimulation and aids wasting. So again, there is clinical evidence for use of cannabinoids, but these are very specifically studied cannabinoids. So again, this isn't taking a whole plant and grinding it up and see what happens. This is taking a very systematic approach to either CBD or THC or a combination of them that you know is standardized, and then studying it for a specific indication, which really is the direction that I think this field hopefully is going to move toward, because the plant is too complicated to study it the way it exists in our dispensary system, unfortunately. We need more rigor behind it at this point. Before I talk about EPIDIOLEX, I just wanted to throw out there that Greenwich created an educational website called Cannabinoid Clinical. So this is not specific to EPIDIOLEX. It's not about promoting product. It is simply about educating on cannabinoid science. This is a huge piece of what we value as a company, is helping to educate the public as well as healthcare providers around this topic. Because the truth is, even our doctors and nurses and pharmacists, they were not trained in cannabinoid science. It was not a part of their education because there wasn't a need. And so we are trying to help get them caught up. And this is also for anyone. You can go onto this website and click around, and there are, it's interactive, and you can kind of learn about THC versus CBD. You can learn what's being studied, what has been published. There's some great resources, and there's a resources tab, and we have a glossary of terms that is really popular with both our healthcare providers and our advocacy groups. That is a PDF, and you can save it and share it. There are discussion guides about if you were to walk into either with your doctor or a dispensary, what are important things to talk to people about when they're considering a product that is not regulated by FDA. So, and then on there, there's also links to other educational resources. So this is getting updated regularly. There's also a map where you can click on your state and see what testing requirements there are for cannabis products that you would find in a dispensary. So it's a really wonderful resource. So I invite you to go there and look around. It is educational, and that's its only goal. So we have a whole team that works just on keeping this updated with new information. And so with that, I'm going to transition into talking about EPIDIOLEX. And so EPIDIOLEX, which is highly purified cannabidiol, is an oral solution indicated for the treatment of seizures associated with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome in patients 2 years and older. It is a weight-based dose in an oral solution, recommended starting at 5 milligrams per kilogram per day, dosed twice daily, so in divided doses. And then the recommended maintenance dose in the label is 10 mg per kg per day, with the option of going up to 20. And so this is, I'll show you the data from our clinical trials. We had both doses in our studies, 10 mg per kg per day and 20. And FDA believe that 10 is the appropriate maintenance dose for most people, but giving the option, if it is being tolerated well, to go up to 20. And there is a dose adjustment in the prescribing information for anyone who has moderate or severe hepatic impairment. And so why did we get so excited about EPIDIOLEX? So I've been in epilepsy, as I mentioned, for 15 years. And there's, one of the first things I heard when I started telling people I was researching epilepsy, the first thing you hear is, well, aren't there a ton of drugs for that already? And I quickly learned that yes, there are a lot of drugs. But people do not understand, in general, the need that still exists. And what was so exciting for me coming to work for this company was that, so there's a whole lot of drugs. In general, the drugs that are out there target the same mechanisms. And I personally, from a scientific side, believe that is why when you look back, we have this, a third of our population continues to be treatment resistant no matter what new drugs come to market. You go back 100 years to when we only had bromides, a third of patients didn't respond. You look at the data this year, a third of patients don't respond. So the drugs got better in terms of their side effect profiles, but were we really getting to the patients that needed it the most? And so what was very exciting about EPIDIOLEX is that it is completely different from every other AED that is out there. It looks different, it acts different, it doesn't overlap with those mechanisms. And so I think that is a really exciting thing for the epilepsy world, is to have a drug that does something totally different. It does not appear to interact with cannabinoid receptors, which is what, so that CB1 is what it's called, the receptor that binds THC. So it does something totally different than THC, which is why it doesn't have those euphoric effects. So it doesn't get you high. We don't know exactly why it works to stop seizures, but we have ideas. And again, it's different than anything we already know exists. We had a really large clinical trial program in LGS and Dravet. We had over 500 patients enrolled in the randomized controlled trials, which does not even get to that we had a really large open access, expanded access program that began even before the clinical trials. This had never really been seen with in these rare syndromes, to be able to enroll this many patients so quickly. It was unprecedented. And then we became the first FDA approved product for Dravet when it was approved in 2018. So what is cannabidiol oral solution? So as I mentioned, there's over 100 unique cannabinoids. CBD is one of them, and it is one of the most abundant. So that's why it is easier. Cannabinoids are not easy to extract from the plant, but CBD being very abundant is one of the more, easily extracted ones from the plant, distinct from all the other cannabinoids you would get from the cannabis plant. We have demonstrated consistent anticonvulsant effect in both preclinical, so animal models, and in clinical studies. And it is now a regulated pharmaceutical formulation of CBD. So it is the only FDA-approved CBD product out there. It is in sesame seed oil as the carrier. Cannabinoids in general, they are very, very hard to dissolve in water, which is why you find them in oils. And that is something that we get asked, like, well, why put it in an oil? Like, that doesn't seem like the best thing for a drug, but it's because it's the only way to really get it in. And being FDA approved means it is held to the highest standards of consistency, quality, and characterization. And to remember that the first thing FDA is concerned with is safety. So they look at safety first. If something is not safe, they don't care if it works really well for what you're studying it for. So the first thing is safety. You have to demonstrate safety. If they believe it's safe, then they will look at your data on efficacy, how well it works. So it is distinct from the other cannabinoid products out there. It's the only one that has been studied in these controlled trials, right? So the other products that you might find out there that are that claim to be highly purified CBD, they have not been studied for safety or efficacy in any kind of trial. We have to manufacture according to good manufacturing practices, and also we have to grow our plants according to good agricultural practices. So this is still a plant-based product. The product is grown and manufactured in the UK, which is where GW Pharmaceuticals is still, our global company is still headquartered. It is tested, every single batch is tested. And so it is really intense. The FDA inspections of these products, they are looking at every step of the process to make sure that it is a consistent product in every single bottle. Something we don't really usually have to talk about with new drugs that come to market, but our drug is legal. So you can carry it across state lines with you. It's prescribed by a doctor, and it is dispensed in pharmacies by licensed pharmacists. So we are now descheduled. So when we were in clinical trials, it was considered a Schedule I substance, which is the most restricted. And when we were originally approved, we were given a Schedule V designation, but we were recently descheduled completely, which makes it easier for doctors and pharmacies. And it makes it, there are fewer controls on like refills and things like that, because it's not a controlled substance anymore. So it's just like any other prescription medicine. Meets FDA standards for quality, stability, and consistency. And again, you know exactly what's in that bottle every single time, which is really important because there are still issues with truth in labeling on the products that are floating around out there that are unregulated. There have been some papers published on the percentage of products that claim to be only CBD and have detectable THC in them, et cetera. So again, FDA is working really hard to get their arms around regulating the other products that are out there. But for now, EPIDIOLEX is the only CBD that has this regulation on it that you know exactly what you're getting every time. So it's a strawberry flavored liquid. It's colorless to yellow in a glass bottle. This is what it looks like. It comes with these syringes. And it is noted that food may affect the levels of EPIDIOLEX. So the prescribing information advises just being consistent. So either always taking it with or always taking it without, so that you don't, because that can change the way your body metabolizes the product. And it comes with these syringes. It is dispensed through a specialty pharmacy. So you may not always get the manufacturer's bottle here. Sometimes it comes in a split bottle from the pharmacy. And the reason that we do that with the specialty pharmacy is because with this weight-based dose, we want to make sure people are getting the appropriate amount of product, which is a liquid, for their supply. And so the specialty pharmacies are able to split those 100 ml bottles to make sure that every family is getting exactly what they need. And once opened, the shelf life is 12 weeks. It's mostly, it can be stored in at room temperature, just in the bottle. The main thing is that is for it to not to freeze. And then again, use within 12 weeks of opening. So very briefly, this is what our studies looked like, so I can show you how it worked for us. The important point here is that this is how drug trials are done in epilepsy. There's nothing unique about this. You basically have a screening phase and then 2 weeks titration. So for 4 weeks during the observation, just counting seizures, and then patients are randomized to the different arms, 2 weeks of titrating up to the target dose, and then their baseline AEDs are held at the same level, so that you don't change those. You can't take people off their baseline meds for epilepsy trials. As you all understand, FDA now says it is unethical to do so. So you cannot do an epilepsy trial in which you force patients to come off of their other medications. You have to add on. And so for us, we had, so this is sort of a combination of our Dravet and LGS studies. We had a 20 mg per kg, 10, or placebo, all added to baseline. And then we had the option, patients could roll into an open label extension and get drug. So if they finished, they could get that drug and stay on it at the cost of the company. And so the company maintained this open label extension for several years following the completion of the study until we had commercial drug available. And about 98% of the patients who completed our trial elected to go into that open label phase. So for the Dravet studies, our primary endpoint was convulsive seizures, which was defined by anything that was countable by the families. I'll focus on the Dravet. LGS was drop seizures. So slightly different because the syndromes have a different profile in terms of the most common seizure type. And we were looking at the percent reduction from that baseline. So that 4 weeks at the beginning when we allowed people just to count their seizures, we wanted to see the change after they were on drug or placebo compared to that baseline. The Dravet study was only up to 18 years old, but in LGS, we went up to 55. So what that means is the important thing is we do have data in adults. There is a misconception that EPIDIOLEX was only approved for pediatrics because they think of Dravet and LGS as pediatric syndromes. But we like to educate people that they are pediatric onset, but that these patients do grow into adulthood. And so we had adults in our study. Exclusions, they could not have been using other cannabinoids. Obviously, this became a problem the later we got as more states started to legalize, but initially it wasn't so challenging to find patients that had not yet used cannabinoids. And the other big one was felbamate initiation within the past year. There are some adverse events that we know can occur in felbamate in the first year, and so anyone who had started felbamate within 1 year was not able to enroll in our studies. So this is what we saw. This is our primary endpoint. We met our primary endpoint in all 3 of these studies. And so if you look at the Dravet, which is on the far right in the Dravet study, so we did have 2 Dravet studies, I'll tell you, but when we presented to FDA, we only had this one complete. We have since completed a study that also has the 10 milligram per kilogram dose, and we saw something very similar. So there was nothing new that we learned in there. But in the 20 milligram per kilogram per day dose, we got a nearly 40% reduction in seizures compared to that baseline, compared to 13 in placebo. And so with that, that we saw efficacy, right? We saw that it provided a benefit to the patients who were in the study. It's also important to know what we saw in terms of side effects. So the most common side effects were sleepiness, decreased appetite, diarrhea, an increase in liver enzymes, which is something that is in the prescribing information as a warning for doctors. And there's a guide in there in terms of how to monitor liver enzymes for anyone who is starting EPIDIOLEX. Also rash, sleep problems, and infections. And so before starting EPIDIOLEX, doctors should monitor liver enzymes, and then they should check them periodically throughout. And there's a guide to that in the prescribing information. And the other thing is about drug interactions. So it may interact with other drugs that you take. And so it's important to talk to your doctor about what you're taking and make sure they know, and any other healthcare providers. This is mainly what I've been educating pharmacists on, is that they want to know all about the drug interactions so that they feel equipped to counsel patients on, frankly, any CBD product that they're taking, because CBD is CBD. So there are drug interactions with cannabidiol and other very common drugs. So what this looked like in our trials is represented here. So the most common at the top. So again, we did see a dose response in that some of our side effects were more common at the higher dose. And so that is why the 10 milligram per kilogram dose is considered the initial maintenance dose. If it's being well tolerated, you can go up to 20 with the knowledge that you might see an increase in some of your side effects. But in general, most side effects were considered mild to moderate by the people in our clinical trials, and most of them occurred during titration. So at the beginning, when they're first adding in EPIDIOLEX and increasing their dose, that's when they were most likely to see side effects. But in general, most people thought that it was a tolerable drug to take. And so with that, I am happy to leave the last bit of time for questions. It was sort of a high-level overview of cannabis and cannabinoids, as well as some basic information about EPIDIOLEX, and I'm really happy to take questions about anything. I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can see your faces if you want to talk to us.
Awesome, thank you so much, Julie. Let's see, a lot of great information there. There's not any questions in the chat screen, so if you guys have any questions that you would like to ask Julie, you can just take yourself off of mute and go ahead and do that.
I have a couple questions. Should I just fire them all at you?
Sure.
What percent THC, what percent THC is EPIDIOLEX?
So it's considered trace amounts.
Okay.
It is like 0.01%. So when you extract cannabinoids from the plant, it is impossible to get rid of everything else.
Yeah.
So EPIDIOLEX in the finished product is considered 98 at least to 99% CBD. That last 1 to 2% is going to be trace amounts of everything in the plant. So you're going to have, the other 100 cannabinoids in tiny, tiny, tiny amounts.
Yeah.
So we can't say it's THC free because of that, but it's not enough to produce an effect on your brain.
Okay. And this, the 10 milligrams per kilogram, was that a 40% decrease in seizures as well? Or was it lower? I missed that slide if there was one.
Yeah, I didn't show it because it's not in the prescribing information right now. That publication came out after we were approved by FDA. With our next label change, we hope that it will be included if FDA chooses to include it in there. But it was similar. It was a little bit lower. We haven't seen a huge dose response in terms of efficacy. It really is patient dependent. So it was similar.
Okay. And just one more question. What was the spasticity? What product were you mentioning? Are you allowed to say? What is that product that specifically?
Yeah, so it is called nabiximols. The brand name ex-US is called Sativex. And so it is a product that is a combination of from two plants, which with their principal cannabinoids being THC and CBD, but it also has minor cannabinoids as well. So yeah, it's approved in, gosh, I think almost 30 countries ex-US for spasticity and multiple sclerosis, but not available here.
Nabiximol?
Nabiximols, yeah.
Okay. I live in Canada, so I can look into it from here.
It is, so in Canada, yeah, the brand name is Sativex in Canada.
Sativex. Okay. And is that like a baclofen type of thing ish?
So it's different than baclofen, but it is, baclofen is the most commonly used drug for spasticity. So I don't know much about in terms of how it's been used, if it's used the same amount as baclofen, but it would be an alternative to baclofen.
Thank you.
We did get a question in the chat box. Someone was just wondering if there were any studies on the effect on IQ or even effects on cognition.
That is a great question. We have not completed any studies on cognition. It is incredibly challenging to do, but we've heard about it a lot and have heard anecdotes from both parents and physicians. And so it is something that we are talking about and looking into and figuring out if there is a way to study it. But currently it has not been studied.
I can share, for that person who asked that question also, I can share some information. My daughter, Lena, was in the study. She started in 2015. She had very limited vocabulary, and I would say within 6 months of her starting EPIDIOLEX, she was able to string more words together. And you could, she's still taking EPIDIOLEX, but you could actually see her connect with you more. So we had always reported that with the doctor, and we saw a decrease in her seizures. But really, like, I really loved the fact that there was so much more cognition that we saw her get better with once she was on that drug. But that's just my experience.
Yeah, and that's what I've heard it from many doctors as well, that gets reported to them, and how they interact with their patients in clinic. And so it is something we've heard a lot about. It is really hard. So it's really hard to study in general. You also need longer studies to see changes usually. And it's hard in this population because the tests that are traditionally designed to assess cognition are not meant to assess cognition in populations with varying degrees of already existing intellectual disability. It's a really challenging place that the research world hasn't done well with. So, but we're having conversations about it, trying to find the most appropriate tests to do that.
Yeah. And even like for my daughter, going back to like her school, if we were all sitting on it across the table at an IEP meeting, like everybody would say, all of her teachers and therapists would say that they really saw a change in her once she began the EPIDIOLEX. Like they all knew that she was on it, even though it was Schedule 1. I didn't hide anything. And they really all saw a change. Like there was just a turning. It was like a switch. Like she just all of a sudden started functioning better.
That's amazing.
We have another question in the chat box. Well, a couple of them actually. Let's see. So if there's any advice that you could give for patients who are currently taking recreational marijuana to manage/prevent seizures?
Unfortunately, I can't. So the biggest challenge obviously is we don't know what's in those products. So it is, and believe me, I'm like the, local expert, my friends, my neighbors, my family, everyone's asking me about not even just seizures. They're like, what should I take? And what I tell people is that from what I know about the space is that it is a calculated risk. You don't know what's in that product. So it's hard to say because, because we don't know what's in it. So until the FDA figures out how to regulate the products that are out there, then it's a trial and error kind of process out there right now, which is not a satisfying answer, I know.
Let's see, here's one. When will EPIDIOLEX be available for prescribing in Canada?
Oh, I wish I knew. I get asked that all the time. Well, at conferences, when we were going to conferences, we would get asked that all the time. And currently, I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
I see in the chat, the educational website it's called cannabinoidclinical.com. I can actually type it into the chat.
I was just going to say, I'll type it in because I wrote it down.
Oh, I did it too, yeah.
Julie's in the hot seat. Does anybody else have any questions?
Come on, we can't let her off this easy.
Are there any specific drugs that are known to cause interactions?
So the main one we know about is clobazam, which was reported out in the trials and is in the prescribing information.
And we are used to the term Onfi.
Yes, Onfi, the brand name. So we do know that, and it's a very common drug in this population, obviously. So we had a lot of patients in our trials that were on it. We do know that Onfi increases the levels of the CBD metabolite, and CBD increases the levels of the Onfi metabolite. And so the main thing about that, it's not a safety issue, it's a tolerability issue in that what we have heard clinically from those patients is that if your Onfi metabolite goes up, you might see increased sleepiness. And so dose adjusting of one or the other is something that is now pretty common. They don't see it in every patient though, so it's not recommended to make any dose adjustments before you start EPIDIOLEX, but if you were to add EPIDIOLEX to Onfi, it's something that, all of the epilepsy community is very aware of this interaction, and so they watch their patients carefully, and if they need to, they'll decrease the dose of Onfi because the metabolite really goes up when you add CBD. So that's the main one that we know about that has been studied and is published. There are a lot of potential drug interactions based on how CBD is metabolized. So it's metabolized through the liver in a very common pathway that a lot of other drugs, even unrelated to epilepsy, not anti-seizure drugs, but other drugs are metabolized that way. And so that's why our pharmacists are now, I think they're doing a lot of due diligence, watching their patients for certain interactions, but we haven't done any other specific studies to know what they are at this point.
So Julie, there weren't any, I guess like any notifications or anything done with Depakote? And I'll tell you the reason why I'm asking is, so my son was one of the first ones on the trial in the very beginning, and his liver enzymes were highly elevated because of the Depakote. So fortunately, we were able to keep lowering the Depakote to where his leveled out, so he could stay on the EPIDIOLEX. But just for to kind of let you guys know, he had started out with 9 Depakote capsules a day, and we were able to drop down to just 1 BID of Depakote to keep him on the EPIDIOLEX. And it works, but with the same seizure control too. So which is huge, because you're also getting them off of more medication, which was great.
Yeah, so the thing with Depakote is that it is not, there is not a known drug interaction the way that like pharmacists would be looking for drug interactions. What we do know about Depakote is, and this is in the prescribing information, is that there is an increased risk of elevated liver enzymes for patients who are on concomitant Depakote and EPIDIOLEX, which we also had a lot of patients. So there were that warning around increased liver enzymes had, there are 3 risk factors associated with it. One was the higher dose. So if you're on a higher dose of EPIDIOLEX, we saw a greater incidence of elevated liver enzymes. Another was if there are elevated liver enzymes at baseline, then it was more likely you would see an increase with EPIDIOLEX. And the third was concomitant Depakote. So there's no specific drug interaction that we've identified, but we know that there is that it is a risk factor for elevated liver.
Right. I'm just glad we were able to kind of figure it out to get him to a point where he was able to stay on it, and coming off of that much Depakote and still keeping, his baseline was great. So.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And actually in our trial, with all the patients that experienced elevated liver enzymes, a third of them, it just resolved. They didn't have to dose adjust anything. Another third, they were able to stay on EPIDIOLEX and just decrease like the dose of either EPIDIOLEX or Depakote, maintain seizure control. And then a third of them did stop EPIDIOLEX, but some were able to re-challenge and it didn't happen again. So most patients were able to resolve it in some way that allowed them to maintain seizure control and stay on the drug, which was a good thing.
Awesome. There was a study here, let's see, are there any specific drugs that are known to cause interactions? Okay, there was a study here when phenobarbital was not allowed in conjunction with CBD. Do you know what the reason would have been for that?
I don't. That's an interesting one. I had not heard that before.
And I'm not sure where he's from.
That's Canada.
Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I've not heard that one before. And specifically phenobarb. None of the other, that's interesting. I don't know.
Any other questions? You guys are quiet today. Well, that just means you did a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you all.
Yes. All right, I think that's going to do it then. Julie, thank you so much for being here today, giving us all this wonderful information. A lot of people tuned in. That's good news. Oh, let's see.
It's just a thank you.
Yeah. All right, you guys. Next Thursday, June 25th, we have special guests from Biocodex to discuss tirapentol, patient access and reimbursement. Make sure you register. Again, this link for today's presentation will be emailed to you. If you don't get it for some reason, you can also go to our website and find it there. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Julie, and hopefully I will see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Julie.
Bye.